The air in the Prosperity Gulch Town Hall was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of old paper, floor polish, and the stale sweat of nervous men. Jack Callahan stood in the center of the room, his worn leather boots silent on the oak floorboards. He felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him, but he only saw one man. Bartholomew Thorne sat behind the main council table, his hands steepled beneath his perfectly groomed silver mustache. He looked completely at ease, a king surveying his court. The other council members, men Jack had known his whole life, were just fixtures in Thorne's grand design. They fidgeted with their collars and avoided his gaze. Thorne cleared his throat, a soft, deliberate sound that cut through the silence. He began to speak, his voice as smooth and cool as the stones at the bottom of a deep well. He spoke of the town charter, a document most men had never read. He mentioned a particular clause, one concerning periods of extreme drought in the community's welfare. Jack's hands, resting at his sides, slowly curled into fists. He knew this drought. He felt it in the cracked earth of his pastures and saw it in the shallow, sluggish flow of Whispering Creek. But this was not about the drought. This was about the land the creek watered, his land. Thorne leaned forward, a predator sensing the final moments of a hunt. He spoke of shared burdens and the greater good. The words were a bitter poison in the hot, still air. Jack's gaze drifted to Caleb Thorne, Bartholomew's younger brother. Caleb was leaning against the far wall, his flashy suit an insult to the dusty town. He was cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife, a lazy, arrogant smirk playing on his handsome face. He was enjoying the show. Jack's jaw tightened until a dull ache radiated up to his temple. He could feel the faint, raised line of the scar there, a souvenir from a long-ago fight with a wildcat. This felt worse. He forced his thoughts back to Red Creek Ranch. He pictured the way the morning sun hit the high pasture, turning the dry grass to gold. He could smell the sweet scent of hay in the loft of the big barn his father had built with his own two hands. His father. Jack could almost feel the weight of the man's heavy silver pocket watch in his own coat. It was a constant, tangible link to the legacy he was sworn to protect, a legacy that was now slipping through his fingers like fine dust. Thorne had dammed a tributary upstream weeks ago, a slow strangulation disguised as progress. Now he was moving in for the final squeeze. The council recognizes the unique position of the Red Creek Ranch, Thorne continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy and the Callahan family's long history here. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. But private history cannot stand in the way of public survival. The creek's flow is at a historic low. The town needs more water, Jack. Your primary water rights, as granted to your grandfather, are a relic of a wetter time. Jack didn't move. He didn't speak. To speak would be to let the rage out. And if he did that, this room would end in chaos. He kept his eyes locked on Thorne. He knew the man's game. Thorne had been buying up failed homesteads for years, consolidating his power piece by piece. Red Creek was the jewel he coveted most, not just for the water, but for the vast, unbroken miles of it. It was the last great independent holding in the county. It was Jack's entire world. Thorne finally laid his cards on the table. The council has reached a decision. We present you with two paths forward, Jack. You may choose one. He held up a single manicured finger. Option 1. You voluntarily cede your primary water rights to Whispering Creek to the township of Prosperity Gulch. You will retain secondary access, of course. Enough for your household. Enough for a household, but not for a herd of 200 cattle. It was a death sentence for the ranch, delivered with a polite smile. Jack felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than any winter morning. He saw his father's dreams turning to brown, withered fields. He saw a lifetime of back-breaking work becoming nothing more than a memory. Or, Thorne said, raising a second finger, there is another way. A way to bind you more closely to this community. A way to demonstrate your commitment to our shared future. He let the suspense build, savoring the moment. Jack could hear the faint ticking of the large clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against his skull. The town charter also speaks of strengthening community bonds through union. Thorne announced, the council proposes a marriage. We have selected a suitable bride for you, a woman of good standing who will be arriving from the east. You will marry her, Jack. You will start a family, become a true pillar of this town, and in doing so, your water rights will be secured under a new familial covenant with Prosperity Gulch. The room was utterly silent. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just his land Thorne wanted. It was his life, his freedom, his future. He would be shackled to a stranger, a woman chosen by his greatest enemy, a spy in his own home, a constant reminder of his own defeat. Caleb Thorne finally looked up from his knife, his smirk widening into a full-blown grin. He was picturing it. He was picturing Jack Callahan, the stubborn, solitary rancher, tamed and trapped by a woman he didn't want. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of fury and despair. He looked from Thorne's smug face to the blank expressions of the councilmen. He saw no help there. They were sheep, and Thorne was the wolf who owned the pasture. He thought of the two choices, a slow death for his land or a quick death for his soul. He could not let the ranch die. He could not be the Callahan who lost it all. The promise he had made at his father's graveside echoed in his ears. Protect the land, always protect the land. The choice was no choice at all. It was a perfectly designed trap, and he had walked right into it. The anger inside him solidified into a cold, hard knot of resolve. He would survive this. The ranch would survive this. He would play Thorne's twisted game. "I'll marry her," Jack said. The words came out low and rough, like stones scraping together. It was the first time he had spoken. A flicker of triumph, quickly suppressed, crossed Thorne's face. "A wise decision, Jack. Truly, a testament to your character." He gestured to a clerk who had been waiting in the corner. The man scurried forward and placed a single sheet of cream-colored paper on the table. It was the marriage contract. It looked clean and official, bearing the town's seal. It was the most obscene thing Jack had ever seen. He walked to the table. His steps were heavy, each one an act of surrender. He stared down at the document. It was all there in stark black ink, an agreement between himself and the town council of Prosperity Gulch. It named him Jack Callahan and a woman he had never met, Eleanor Vance. The name meant nothing to him. It was the name of his jailer. He picked up the pen. The wood was smooth and cool against his calloused fingers. For a moment he hesitated. He could feel every eye in the room on his hand. He could feel Caleb's mocking gaze burning into the back of his neck. He thought of the wind blowing through the cottonwoods along the creek. He thought of the lowing of his cattle at dawn. He thought of the quiet dignity of his home. He would not lose it. His signature was sharp and angry, a black slash across the bottom of the page. He dropped the pen. It clattered against the table, the sound echoing in the profound silence. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at anyone. He simply turned and walked out of the town hall, his back straight and rigid. The bright afternoon sun hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment the dusty main street of Prosperity Gulch seemed alien and hostile. He had saved his ranch, but he had just sold his life. The week that followed was a blur of grim, relentless work. Jack threw himself into his chores with a silent fury, mending fences from sunup to sundown, riding the long fences of his property as if to reassure himself that it was all still there. But the land felt different. A shadow had fallen over it. The contract he signed had tainted the very air he breathed. He barely slept, and when he did, he dreamed of a faceless woman walking through the rooms of his house, her presence an unwelcome ghost. He ate his meals standing up in the kitchen, the silence of the empty farmhouse pressing in on him. He was more alone than he had ever been in his life. Then the day came. A telegram had arrived 2 days prior, informing him of the train's schedule. He saddled his horse and rode into town, the dread a heavy weight in his gut. He had put on his good shirt, the one he wore for funerals, and a clean coat. It felt like a costume for a play he never wanted to be in. Now he stood on the wooden platform of the Prosperity Gulch station. The wind whistled through the gaps in the boards, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall. The station master was busy in his office, leaving Jack completely alone with his thoughts. He pulled his father's silver watch from his pocket. The worn case was smooth and comforting in his palm. He flipped it open. The tiny, rhythmic ticking was a sound from a better time, a time of certainty. He wasn't checking the hour. He was holding on to the last piece of a world that no longer existed. Who was she, this Eleanor Vance? His mind conjured images, each one worse than the last. A frail, weeping girl, terrified and useless. Or perhaps a hard-faced spinster sent west because no one else would have her. Worst of all, he imagined a woman like Thorne, cool, calculating, and cruel, sent to undermine him from within, to report his weaknesses back to her master. He braced himself for the worst, building a wall of cold resentment around his heart. He would be civil, he would be correct, but he would not let her in. She was a condition of his survival, not a partner in his life. The house was big. They could exist in separate orbits, two strangers under one roof. A long, mournful whistle cut through the air, startling him from his dark thoughts. He snapped the watch shut and shoved it back into his pocket. He looked down the shimmering steel tracks that disappeared into the vast, empty horizon. Far in the distance, a dark shape was growing larger. Above it, a plume of black smoke billowed into the pale blue sky. It was a stain on the landscape. The engine was coming, chugging steadily closer, bringing with it the woman who held the other end of his chain. Jack stood perfectly still, his face a mask of stone, and watched as his forced future came rushing toward him. The hissing steam was a serpent's breath, coiling in the dry air. Jack Callahan stood rigid on the wooden platform, his boots planted in the dust as if he could root himself to the spot. The approaching roar of the engine was a physical blow, a sound he had been dreading for 2 weeks. It was the sound of his surrender. The plume of smoke he had watched from afar now resolved into a monstrous black engine, all iron and fire, slowing with a grinding screech of metal on metal. People bustled around him, greeting loved ones with smiles and embraces. For Jack, the train was not delivering a person, but a sentence. His hands, shoved deep into his pockets, were clenched into useless fists. He had imagined her 100 different ways, each one worse than the last. He pictured a woman with Bartholomew Thorne's greedy eyes, or a frail, weeping girl who would be another mouth to feed and a burden on his soul. He almost hoped for the latter. Pity was an emotion he could manage, a clean and simple weight. Contempt was even easier. But what he feared most was the unknown, the specific shape of the cage he had just built around his own life. The train shuddered to a final, gasping halt. A door slid open, and there she was. She was not what he had expected. Not at all. The woman who descended the steel steps moved with a quiet composure that felt utterly out of place in the dusty caves of Prosperity Gulch. Her traveling dress was a simple dark blue cotton, but it was well made and fit her perfectly. It was practical, not ostentatious. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, revealing a high forehead and intelligent, steady eyes the color of a stormy sky. She carried no parasol, no frivolous handbag. She simply stood for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the small station, taking in the scene with an unnerving calmness. She looked less like a victim being delivered and more like a general surveying a new battlefield. This, Jack realized with a sinking heart, was worse. This was not a woman he could pity or easily dismiss. There was a strength in her stillness that irritated him on a profound level. It was the composure of someone who was not afraid, and he desperately wanted her to be afraid. He wanted her to see his hard, sun-weathered face in the unforgiving landscape and feel a tremor of the despair that was currently suffocating him. But her gray eyes found his across the platform, and they held no fear. They held only a quiet, unnerving assessment. For a long moment, they just stood there, separated by 20 yards of dust and the chattering crowd. She was the anchor, and he was the boat straining at the end of its rope. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to get on his horse and ride, until the sound of that damnable train was just a memory. But he couldn't. The contract was signed. The land, his father's land, depended on this. His legacy depended on this charade. Swallowing the bile that rose in his throat, he forced his legs to move. Each step was heavy, a trudge through thick mud. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of soap and the dust from her travels. He didn't offer a hand, he didn't offer a name. He offered a nod, an impossibly small, curt movement of his head that was more an insult than a greeting. It was all the welcome he could muster. "You're her," he said. The words were gravel in his mouth. Eleanor Vance looked at the man before her. He was taller than she'd imagined, his shoulders broad under a worn cotton shirt. The sun had carved lines around his sharp blue eyes and baked his skin to the color of the earth. A faded white scar ran along his jaw, a stark contrast to his dark, unruly hair. She saw the resentment burning in him like a fever. It was a palpable force, a wall of heat between them. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. She met his cold gaze without flinching. "I am Eleanor Vance," she replied, her voice even and clear. It carried no plea, no apology. A porter appeared with a single large leather trunk, its corners scuffed from long journeys. Jack's eyes flickered to it. Just one. He had expected a mountain of hat boxes and cases, another detail that didn't fit his narrative of a pampered city woman. Without a word, he shouldered the trunk himself, the heavy weight a welcome, grounding pain. He grunted under the load and turned his back on her, starting toward the buckboard wagon waiting at the edge of the street. He didn't check to see if she was following. He knew she would be. She had nowhere else to go. The ride back to Red Creek Ranch was a study in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves, the constant creak of the wagon's wooden frame, and the sigh of the wind sweeping across the plains. They sat side by side on the hard wooden bench, a chasm of unspoken hostility separating them more effectively than any physical distance. Jack kept his eyes fixed forward, his knuckles white on the leather reins. He could feel her presence beside him, a subtle weight, a quiet breath. It was an intrusion, a violation of the solitude that had been his only comfort for so many years. He glanced at the land they passed, his land. Every fence post, every dip in the terrain, every distant, grazing steer was a part of him. He knew this place like the back of his own calloused hand. And now he saw it through her eyes. He imagined her disdain for the endless brown grass, the dust devils dancing in the distance, the brutal, unblinking sun. He felt a surge of defensive pride, immediately followed by a wave of bitter anger. This land was the reason she was here. To save it, he had invited the enemy into its very heart. The woman beside him was the price, a price he would be paying every single day, every single hour. Ellie, for her part, did not see an empty wasteland. She saw space. After a lifetime spent in drawing rooms and suffocating parlors, the sheer, unending scope of the sky was a revelation. It was beautiful in its starkness, its raw, untamed power. She watched the man beside her, the rigid set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw. She saw the rage he was bottling up and understood its source. She was the symbol of his defeat, a walking, breathing reminder of his humiliation at the hands of Bartholomew Thorne. She was not offended by his silence or his coldness. It was honest, at least. In her old life, everything had been veiled in polite lies. This raw, undisguised resentment was something she could work with. It was a known quantity. Her gaze drifted from his tense profile to the passing landscape. She noted a section of fence that was sagging, a gate that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. She saw that the cattle, though lean, looked healthy. Her mind, sharp and observant, was already cataloging details, assessing strengths and weaknesses. She was not here to be a wife in any traditional sense. She was here to survive. And to do that, she needed to understand this place, and the man who was now, by law, her husband. The silence was not empty for her either. It was filled with information. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The heat of the day started to recede, replaced by a cooling breeze. Jack steered the horses up a low rise, and the ranch came into view. The farmhouse was a simple two-story wooden structure, its paint faded and peeling in places. It was flanked by a large, sturdy barn and a web of corrals. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. It was not a grand estate, but it was solid. It was real. It was a home built with sweat and struggle, and Jack felt a familiar pang of pride. Then the shame hit him again, hot and sharp. He was bringing her here, this stranger, to the house his mother had kept, to the porch where his father had taught him to read. It felt like a betrayal. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the dusty yard. The silence that fell was different now. It was heavier, charged with the imminence of arrival. Without a word, Jack swung down from the driver's seat, His movements were stiff. He went to the back of the wagon and hauled her trunk out, setting it down on the porch with a heavy, final thud. He did not look at her. He did not offer her a hand to help her down from the high seat. Ellie waited a moment, but when it became clear no help was forthcoming, she gathered her skirts and descended on her own. Her boots landed softly in the dirt. She stood for a second, brushing the dust from her dress, her composure unshaken. She looked at the house. It was dark inside, the windows like vacant eyes. It was rustic, weathered, and deeply lonely. It looked exactly like the man who refused to look at her. She walked past him, her head held high, and stopped before the front door. Her hand rested on the cool metal of the doorknob for a beat. This was it, the next chapter, a world away from everything she had ever known. She took a quiet breath, a small, private moment of steeling herself for whatever lay beyond that door. Then she turned the knob and stepped inside, disappearing into the shadows of the house. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Jack alone in the fading light. He remained frozen, his back to the house. He could feel it there, a weight on his soul. The house where he was born, the house where he was now a prisoner. He slowly lifted his head, not toward the closed door, but toward the sprawling expanse of his land. The last rays of sun bathed the hills in a soft golden light. It was so beautiful it hurt. He had fought for this, he had bled for this, and he had just signed away his life for this. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, and for the first time in his life, standing on his own property felt like being completely and utterly lost. The front door clicked shut, the sound unnervingly final in the vast emptiness of the night. Jack did not follow her inside. He stood on the porch, his boots planted on the weathered wood his father had laid, and stared out at the dark silhouette of the hills. His land, his prison. The air, usually a comfort with its familiar scent of dry earth and pine, felt thin and hostile. A stranger was in his home. A stranger sent by his enemy, wearing the mask of a wife, was now under his roof. He felt the cold weight of the marriage contract in his mind, a legal chain wrapped tight around his throat. He spent the night not in his own bed, but on the lumpy horsehair sofa in the main room. Sleep was a distant shore he couldn't reach. Every creak of the old house, every sight of the wind against the windows, was her. He imagined her in his parents' room, in the bed his mother had passed away in. The thought was a hot spike of anger and violation. This was not just a house. It was a sanctuary of memory, a fortress built of solitude, and its walls had been breached without a single shot fired. He had traded his peace for water. He lay there, staring into the oppressive darkness, his calloused hands clenched into fists, wondering if the trade had been worth it. He felt the phantom weight of his father's pocket watch in his pocket, a cold, silent accusation. Dawn was not a gentle arrival, but a slow, gray infiltration of the dark. Jack rose before the sun, his body stiff and his mind gritty with exhaustion. The routine was his anchor. He would make a pot of thick, bitter coffee, check on the livestock, and then begin the endless list of chores that kept the ranch breathing. It was the same rhythm he had followed every day for the last 10 years, a solitary beat that defined his existence. But as he swung his legs off the sofa, a scent stopped him. It was faint, but unmistakable. Wood smoke and coffee. He stood frozen for a moment, listening. There was a soft clinking sound from the kitchen, the gentle scrape of metal on iron. It was a sound of domestic life, a sound that had been absent from this house for so long it felt all alien. He moved toward the kitchen, his steps silent on the floorboards, his posture wary. He expected to find a disaster, a helpless city woman struggling with his cast iron stove, perhaps weeping with frustration. He was prepared for tears and accusations. He was not prepared for what he saw. Eleanor Vance stood with her back to him, her posture straight and calm. She had found an old apron in a drawer and tied it around her waist. The fire in the stove was burning low and even, a perfect bed of coals for cooking. A cast iron skillet sat on top, and from it rose the rich, salty smell of frying bacon. On the counter, a bowl of flour and a tin of lard sat next to a tray of perfectly formed, uncooked biscuits. A percolator bubbled quietly on the back of the stove, releasing the dark, wonderful aroma that had woken him. She was not struggling, she was not crying, she was simply making breakfast. She must have heard him, but she didn't turn around. She calmly used a fork to turn the strips of bacon in the pan, the sizzle filling the quiet room. Jack stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home, utterly wrong-footed. He had built a fortress of expectations around this woman, casting her as a fragile, useless pawn in Thorne's game. He had envisioned her as another mouth to feed, another problem to solve, a constant, cloying reminder of his defeat. This quiet, capable scene in his kitchen did not fit into that narrative. It was a piece from a different puzzle entirely. "The coffee's ready," she said, her voice even, without looking at him. She gestured with the fork toward the percolator. "I wasn't sure how you took it." Jack moved stiffly toward the stove. His own tin mug was sitting on the counter, next to another one he hadn't seen in years. It was his mother's, painted with small, faded blue flowers. The sight of it was a small, sharp pain in his chest. He poured the steaming black liquid into his mug, the familiar ritual feeling strange and foreign under her placid gaze. He didn't speak. He couldn't find the words. Resentment still coiled in his gut, but now it was tangled with a confusing thread of shock. She slid the cooked bacon onto a plate and placed the tray of biscuits into the small oven built into the side of the stove. Her movements were efficient, economical, with no wasted energy. She moved around his kitchen as if she had been doing it for years, her hands sure and steady. He watched her, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He had expected to be the one in control this morning, the one setting the tone of their grim cohabitation. Instead, he felt like an intruder. "Sit," she said, finally turning to face him. Her gray eyes were clear and direct, holding no plea, no fear, no anger. They were just watchful. "It will be a few minutes for the biscuits." He sat at the worn kitchen table, the wood smooth under his forearms. He placed his mug down, the sound loud in the tense silence. He had planned to ignore her, to treat her like a piece of furniture he was forced to keep. But she wasn't furniture. She was a presence, a quiet force that had already begun to alter the gravity of his world. She sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for the biscuits to bake. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He should have been furious. He was furious. But the anger was now aimed at his own assumptions. Bartholomew Thorne had sent him a wife, and Jack had assumed she would be a reflection of Thorne's other brother, Caleb. Flashy, useless, and cruel. A burden designed to break his spirit. This woman was none of those things. She was quiet, she was composed, and she knew how to cook on a wood stove. The smell of baking biscuits soon filled the kitchen, a warm, comforting scent from a life he thought was long gone. It was the smell of his mother's kitchen, the smell of home, and it came from the hands of the woman who was meant to be his ruin. When she pulled the tray from the oven, the biscuits were golden brown and perfectly risen. She placed them on the table with the bacon and a pot of honey. They ate in silence. Jack took a biscuit. It was light, flaky, and melted in his mouth. It was better than any he could make himself. He ate it slowly, the simple act of eating this woman's food feeling like a concession, a surrender of some small, vital piece of his anger. He hated that it was good. He hated the way she simply ate, her gaze directed at her plate, as if this was the most normal thing in the world, a husband and wife sharing breakfast. The thought was so absurd, so far from the truth of their situation, that a bitter laugh almost escaped him. After the meal, he stood up and took his plate to the wash basin. He expected her to let him, to fall into the role of the served lady. Instead, she was right behind him, her own plate in hand. "I'll take care of that," she said, her voice still mild. "You have work to do, I imagine. A ranch this size doesn't run itself." He stopped, his back to her. "I can wash my own plate." His voice was rough, clipped. "I know," she replied. There was a pause. "But it's a small thing I can do. Let me do it." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. He stepped aside, his shoulder almost brushing hers. He felt a strange jolt at the near contact, a spark of awareness that had nothing to do with anger. He left the kitchen without another word, grabbing his worn hat and coat from the peg by the door. He needed air. He needed the familiar burn of labor in his muscles. He needed to be far away from the quiet, confusing woman in his kitchen. The morning was cold and bright. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. He saddled his horse, the familiar motions of cinching the saddle and checking the bridle a comfort. His horse, Ajax, nickered softly, nudging his shoulder. It was a simple, honest interaction, and Jack leaned into it for a moment, resting his forehead against the horse's powerful neck. Out here, things made sense. Animals had needs. The land had demands. You met them, or you failed. There were no hidden motives, no quiet games of power. His plan for the day was to ride the southern fence line. A storm a few weeks back had knocked down a tree, and he knew a section of the wire fence was likely damaged. It was a long ride and a full day's work to fix it alone. As he rode, he imagined Ellie back at the house. What would she do all day? Stare out the window? Explore the house, touching his parents' things, invading his memories? The thought brought a fresh wave of resentment. He pictured her in her fine, simple dress, completely out of place in the rustic, dusty reality of his life. She would be bored within an hour, he thought. By nightfall, she would be begging him to take her back to town, back to whatever life she had come from. A grim satisfaction settled in him. Let her see what it was really like. Let her feel the isolation, the crushing weight of the silence. The sun climbed higher, beating down on his neck. The land stretched out around him, a sea of brown and gold under the endless sky. This was what he was fighting for. Every blade of grass, every dusty acre. He would endure the woman. He would endure the sham of a marriage, as long as he could keep this. He would not let Thorn win. The thought hardened his resolve. He would work until his hands bled. He would outlast them all. He reached the southern boundary by late morning. Just as he suspected, a large, dead cottonwood had fallen across the fence, snapping two posts and leaving a long stretch of wire tangled and useless on the ground. It was a significant break, large enough for a dozen head of cattle to wander through. He dismounted, tying Ajax to a sturdy tree nearby. He unstrapped his tools from the saddle, a post hole digger, a heavy mallet, wire cutters, and a spool of new wire. He set to work, his movements practiced and efficient. First, he cleared the fallen tree, hacking away the smaller branches with his hatchet, and then using Ajax to drag the heavy trunk away from the fence line. The sun was relentless, and sweat soon soaked through his shirt. This was his element. The strain of muscle, the solid thud of the axe, the smell of dust in his own sweat. This was real. After clearing the debris, he began the hard work of digging new post holes. The ground was hard and rocky, and each hole was a battle. As he worked, his mind drifted back to the woman in his house. He wondered if she had tried to light the fire again and failed. He wondered if she was staring at the four walls, feeling the weight of the emptiness he had lived with for years. He hoped she was. He hoped she was miserable. It was a cruel thought, but it was the only defense he had. He was ramming the first new post into place when he saw it, a flicker of movement in the distance near the creek bed. He squinted, his hand shielding his eyes from the glare. It was a person walking steadily toward his position. His first instinct was alarm. Strangers on his land were rarely a good sign. He straightened up, his hand dropping to rest near the handle of the revolver on his hip. He watched as the figure grew closer. Too small to be Caleb Thorne, not dressed like any of the other ranchers. Then his breath caught in his throat. It was her. It was Eleanor. She was walking with a steady, unhurried pace, carrying something in her hands. He stood frozen by the fence post, watching her approach. What in God's name was she doing out here? It was a 5-mile walk from the farmhouse. He felt a surge of irritation. Had she come out here to complain? To tell him she was leaving? He braced himself for a confrontation. As she drew nearer, he saw she was no longer wearing the pristine dress from the train. She had changed into a simple, durable-looking skirt and a plain work shirt. Her hair was tied back, and a smudge of dirt was streaked across one cheek. In her hands, she carried a canvas bag and a large canteen of water. She stopped about 10 feet away from him, her gaze taking in the broken fence, the tools, and his own sweat-soaked appearance. "I thought you might need this," she said, her voice calm and even, not breathless at all from the long walk. She held out the canteen. "And I brought food." Jack stared at her. He had been expecting anything but this. Accusations, demands, tears. He had not been expecting practical, thoughtful help. He didn't move. He just watched her, his mind struggling to process the information. She didn't seem to notice his shock. She set the canvas bag down and opened it, revealing thick sandwiches wrapped in cloth and a few apples. She placed them in the shade of a small mesquite tree. Then she walked over to the section of broken fence, her eyes scanning the damage with a critical, assessing gaze. The posts are snapped clean, she observed, more to herself than to him. But the wire looks salvageable. She then did something that completely shattered Jack's remaining expectations. She walked over to his pile of tools, picked up the wire cutters, and went to work on the tangled mess of the old fence. Her hands, which he had assumed were soft and delicate, moved with a surprising confidence. She snipped the tangled sections, her movements precise, saving the long, unbroken lengths and coiling them neatly. Jack just stood there, mallet in hand, and watched. He was utterly speechless. He had been prepared for a fight. He had been prepared for a burden. He was not prepared for a partner. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for instruction. She saw a job that needed doing, and she simply began to do it. He finally found his voice, and it came out rougher than he intended. "What are you doing?" She looked up, pausing in her work. Her gray eyes met his. "I'm helping," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is a big job for one person. It will go faster with two." She turned back to the wire, her attention once again focused on the task. Jack's mind reeled. He had spent the entire morning pitying her, imagining her trapped and helpless in the farmhouse. All the while she had been preparing, packing food and water, and walking 5 miles across rough country to find him, to help him. He felt a strange, unsettling feeling in his chest. His anger and resentment were still there, a hard knot in his stomach. But now they were joined by something else, a profound and jarring confusion. This woman was not the pawn he had imagined. Pawns were passive. They were moved around the board by others. This woman moved herself. He went back to his own work, digging the second post hole, his movements now heavy and thoughtful. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft snip of the wire cutters, of the quiet industry just a few yards away. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, the only sounds the scrape of his shovel against rock and the metallic tang of her work with the wire. The silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared rhythm of labor. When he had the second hole dug, he looked up. She had untangled and salvaged nearly all the usable wire. She was now using a rock to hammer out the kinks from a long section, her brow furrowed in concentration. She hadn't complained about the heat, the dust, or the hard work. She simply did it. He watched her for a long moment, hidden in the shadow of his hat brim. He watched the sure, steady way she worked, her hands moving with a purpose that belied her seemingly delicate frame. A flicker of doubt, small but persistent, ignited in his mind. He had been so certain he knew who she was, what she represented. He had seen her as a symbol of his humiliation, a living embodiment of Thorne's victory. But as he watched her methodically repair the fence that protected his land, his legacy, that certainty began to crumble. Who was this woman? Where did she come from, that she knew the rhythms of hard work and the quiet language of a broken fence line? He had prepared himself to fight a war against Bartholomew Thorne and the helpless woman he'd sent. He looked at Eleanor, her face set with determination as she stretched a length of wire, and for the first time he felt a deep, unnerving flicker of doubt about who she really was. The days that followed settled into a quiet, brittle routine. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with unspoken questions. Jack worked the land with a relentless energy, trying to sweat out the unease that had taken root inside him. He would see her moving about the property, a ghost in a practical dress, her purpose always clear, even when her past was not. She was a constant, unsettling presence, a puzzle he had no interest in solving. Yet, his eyes were drawn to her, watching from the corner of his vision as he drove fence posts or mended a trough. He saw the efficiency in her movements, the same steadiness he'd witnessed when she repaired the fence. It was the careful economy of someone who understood work, and it didn't fit the picture of the woman Thorne had forced upon him. This morning the air was still cool, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gold. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the barn. Jack had been up since before dawn, harnessing his best workhorse, a massive bay gelding named Titan. The animal was the engine of the farm, strong and dependable, the key to getting the north field plowed before the ground baked hard as brick. The rhythmic clinking of the harness was a familiar comfort, a sound that belonged to his father, and his father's father before him. It was the sound of survival. He led Titan out into the field, the plowshare biting into the dark, rich earth. The work was grueling, a battle of will between man, beast, and soil. Jack leaned into the plow handles, his muscles coiling and releasing in a familiar cadence. Sweat beaded on his brow and traced paths through the grime on his neck. Behind him, the turned earth lay in a neat, dark ribbon, a sign of progress, of a future he was still fighting for. For a few hours, there was only the work, the strain in his shoulders, the creak of leather, the heavy breathing of the horse, and the earth giving way. He could almost forget the woman in the house. He could almost forget the contract sitting in a drawer, a constant reminder of his bondage. Then it happened. A sharp, grating sound of metal scraping against stone, followed by a sudden jolt. Titan stumbled, pulling up short with a distressed snort. The plow lurched to a halt, digging uselessly into the ground. Jack swore, a low, guttural sound of pure frustration. He immediately let go of the handles and went to the horse's side, running a hand down its powerful leg. Titan was favoring his front left hoof, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Jack gently lifted the hoof, his heart sinking as he saw the problem. The shoe was gone, ripped clean off. A couple of the nails had been bent and pulled, leaving the hoof wall slightly ragged. A wave of hot anger washed over him. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a disaster. The plowing had to be finished this week. The nearest competent blacksmith was in Somerville, a good 6-hour ride each way. That meant a full day lost, maybe more if the smith was busy. He couldn't afford to lose a day. He couldn't afford to lose an hour. The thought of going to the blacksmith in Prosperity Gulch was out of the question. The man was one of Thorne's cronies, and Jack would rather walk on hot coals than give him his business or endure his smirking pity. He let the horse's hoof down and stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. The sun felt hotter now, more oppressive. The silence of the stalled plow was deafening. Every second that ticked by was a victory for Bartholomew Thorne. Jack could almost feel the man's smug satisfaction, could picture him sitting in his plush office, confident that the ranch would fail under the weight of 1,000 small cuts like this one. He kicked at a clod of dirt, the frustration, a bitter taste in his mouth. He was alone. He had always been alone in this fight, and this was just another reminder. Another problem he would have to solve with his own 2 hands, his own sweat. He unhitched the big horse, his movements sharp and angry. He would have to saddle up his riding mare, Bess, and start the long journey to Somerville. The plowing would wait. The ranch would wait. Everything would wait while he paid the price for a single unlucky step. He led the limping Titan back toward the barn, his jaw set in a hard line. As he approached the farmhouse, he saw Ellie step out onto the porch. She was holding a tin cup of water, and she watched him approach, her expression unreadable. He expected a question. He expected some useless expression of sympathy, or worse, a suggestion that would only highlight her ignorance of his world. He braced himself for it, ready to bite her head off, to tell her to go back inside where she belonged. But she said nothing. She simply watched him, her gray eyes following his every move as he led the huge horse toward the water trough. The silence stretched thick with his own simmering rage. He refused to look at her, refused to acknowledge her. He was an island, and he would not be invaded by her pity. After Titan had drunk his fill, Jack tied him loosely to a post in the shade of the barn. He turned to head for the tack room to get Bess's saddle, his mind already on the long, dusty ride ahead. As he passed the porch, Ellie spoke. Her voice was calm, not a hint of alarm in it. "He threw a shoe," she said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Jack stopped, but he didn't turn to face her. "He did," he clipped out, his voice tight. He waited for the inevitable, useless follow-up. But again, it didn't come. Instead, he heard the soft sound of her setting the cup down on the porch railing. He heard the whisper of her dress as she came down the steps. He still didn't look. He just wanted her to go away, to leave him to his misery. Let him get on with what needed to be done. "Wait here," she said, her voice still quiet but now carrying a strange note of authority. Before he could even process the words, or the sheer audacity of her giving him an order, she walked past him. She didn't head for the house. She walked directly toward the dark, cavernous mouth of the barn. Jack finally turned, a dumbfounded expression on his face. What in the hell did she think she was doing? Was she going to fetch him a bucket of sympathy? A useless poultice for the horse's mood? The flicker of annoyance he felt began to grow into a slow-burning fire of irritation. This was her, wasn't it? The city girl, trying to help in the only way she knew how, by getting in the way. He stood frozen for a moment, watching the space where she had disappeared. He was about to march in after her, to tell her to stay out of his business, when she reappeared. She was carrying something in her arms. It was heavy, wrapped in thick, oil-stained leather and tied with a worn strap. Dust puffed from it with every step she took. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew that bundle. He hadn't seen it in years, not since his father had passed. It was his father's old farrier tool roll, a complete set of rasps, hoof knives, clinchers, and hammers, all carefully maintained but long forgotten, tucked away on a high shelf in the back of the barn. He had assumed the leather had rotted away, the tools rusted into uselessness. He had never even thought to look for them. It had been easier to ride to town, to pay someone else. It had been easier than touching something that so profoundly reminded him of his father. Ellie walked past him without a word and set the heavy roll down on a clean patch of ground near the horse. She untied the leather strap, and the bundle fell open with a soft thud and a jingle of steel. The tools were not rusted. They were coated in a thin layer of protective grease, dark and well-preserved. The wooden handles were smooth and dark with age, the steel heads showing the marks of long use but no neglect. They were ready. They were perfect. Jack stared, utterly speechless. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. How did she even know what they were? How did she know where to find them? He had lived his entire life in this barn, and he had forgotten they existed. Ellie paid him no mind. She approached Titan, who was still shifting his weight, agitated and uncomfortable. She didn't reach for his bridle. Instead, she just stood beside his massive head, speaking to him in a low, soothing murmur. Her voice was a gentle current in the tense air. She ran a hand down his neck, her touch light but firm. Jack watched as the big horse, who could be stubborn and difficult even with him, visibly relaxed under her touch. The tension went out of his powerful shoulders. He lowered his head slightly, blowing a soft breath from his nostrils. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, stroking the spot just behind his ear. "We'll get you fixed right up. Just a little stone in your shoe, that's all." Her calmness was absolute. There was no fear, no hesitation. She moved as if she had done this 100 times before. After a moment, she walked back to the tool roll and picked up a hoof pick and a knife. She returned to the horse's side and said, "Easy now, let me see." She bent down and lifted the heavy hoof, resting it securely on her thigh. Jack's brain struggled to reconcile the image before him. This woman, who looked like she belonged in a drawing room sipping tea, was effortlessly holding the hoof of a 1,000-pound animal. Her dress was getting covered in dust and dirt, but she didn't seem to notice or care. With practiced, efficient movements, she began to clean the hoof, scraping away the packed-in dirt and examining the hoof wall where the nails had torn free. Jack found himself easing a step closer, then another. He was mesmerized. He had seen his father do this countless times, but seeing it now, performed by her, felt unreal, like a dream. He watched her hands. They were not the soft, delicate hands he had imagined. They were capable, her fingers sure and strong as she worked. She trimmed the ragged edges of the hoof wall with the knife, her movements precise and economical. There was no wasted effort, no uncertainty. "There's a spare shoe in the small crate on the second shelf by number 1, she said, her voice slightly strained from her bent position, but still perfectly calm. She didn't look up at him. He was so stunned, it took him a second to react. He felt a flush of embarrassment. She was telling him where his own supplies were. He turned and walked woodenly into the barn, his boots echoing in the sudden silence. He found the crate exactly where she said it would be. It was dusty, but inside were a half dozen new horseshoes of various sizes. He grabbed one that looked about right for Titan and brought it out, feeling like a clumsy apprentice. She took it from him without a word, checked it against the hoof, and nodded. "This will do. I need a fire." A fire, of course. The shoe needed to be heated and shaped for a perfect fit. The small forge in the corner of the barn hadn't been lit in a decade. It was another piece of his father's world he had let fall into disuse. He felt a fresh pang of shame, sharper this time. While he was out fighting battles with his fists and his pride, he had let the heart of his own ranch grow cold. He went to the forge, his movements mechanical. He cleared the cobwebs, loaded the hearth with coal, and worked the bellows. The embers took a moment to catch, then a small orange glow began to spread, pulsing with each push of the handle. It felt like he was breathing life back into a lung that had long collapsed. Soon, a steady, hot fire was burning. Ellie brought the shoe over, holding it with a long pair of tongs she had pulled from the tool roll. She placed it into the heart of the coals. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the hiss and crackle of the fire and the rhythmic sigh of the bellows as Jack worked it. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning coal and hot metal. He watched her face illuminated by the orange glow of the forge. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her gray eyes fixed on the shoe as it began to glow a dull red, then a brighter cherry. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Her hair, which was usually so neatly tied, had strands that had escaped and now clung to her damp forehead. In that moment, she looked nothing like the woman who had stepped off the train. She looked like she belonged here. More than he did, perhaps. The thought was a disloyal one, and he pushed it away, but it lingered. When the shoe was hot enough, she pulled it from the fire and carried it to the anvil. The ringing clang of her hammer striking the hot steel shattered the quiet. It was a clean, pure sound, a sound of creation. She worked quickly, turning the shoe, tapping it here, flattening it there, her arm moving in a powerful, steady rhythm. Sparks flew with each blow, showering the dusty ground around her. Jack watched, his hands still on the bellows, his mouth slightly agape. This wasn't guesswork. This was skill. This was artistry, learned over countless hours of practice. She checked the fit against the hoof several times, making small adjustments with the hammer until she was satisfied. Then she plunged the still glowing shoe into a bucket of water. It erupted in a furious cloud of steam, the violent hiss a final exclamation point on her work. The metal cooled, turning from an angry red to a dull, dark gray. Now came the most difficult part, the nailing. She positioned the cooled shoe on the prepared hoof. She selected nails from a small pouch in the tool roll. With the hoof still cradled on her leg, she took her hammer and with a few quick, precise taps, drove the first nail home. The nail emerged from the side of the hoof wall exactly where it should, high enough to be secure, low enough to avoid the sensitive inner part of the hoof. She repeated the process with the other nails, her confidence unwavering. Titan stood perfectly still, as if he understood he was in capable hands. With all the nails in place, she used a clinching tool to bend the tips of the nails over, locking the shoe securely in place. Finally, she took a rasp and filed the edges smooth. She ran her hand over the finished work, a final checking motion. Then she gently lowered the horse's foot to the ground. "There," she said, her voice soft. "All done." Titan took a tentative step, then another, putting his full weight on the newly shod hoof. There was no limp, no hesitation. He was sound. He was whole. The crisis was over. The day was saved. The plowing could continue. Ellie stood up, stretching her back. She wiped her sweaty hands on her dress, leaving dark smudges on the fabric. She looked tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She gave Titan one last pat on the neck, then turned and began to calmly roll the tools back into their leather wrap. She worked methodically, wiping each tool clean with a rag before placing it in its designated slot. It was the careful reverence of someone who respected good tools. Jack just stood there watching her. The anger and frustration he had felt up earlier had evaporated, replaced by a profound and unsettling sense of awe. He felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about this woman, about his situation, was wrong. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a helpless victim. She was something else entirely. Something he could not comprehend. She finished packing the tools and tied the leather strap. She picked up the heavy bundle and walked back toward the barn to put it away, as if she had just finished a simple chore like washing dishes. She moved past him, her face averted, as if she was embarrassed by the display, or perhaps just eager for it to be over. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the echo of the hammer, the smell of hot steel, and the weight of 1,000 new questions. Jack's mind reeled. The daughter of some wealthy family, sent here to be his wife. Women like that learn needlepoint and French. They learned how to play the piano. They did not learn how to shoe a horse with the practiced skill of a master blacksmith. It made no sense. Nothing about her made any sense. He watched her disappear into the shadows of the barn. His own hands felt clumsy and useless. She had solved a problem that would have cost him a full day, maybe more, and she had done it without a word of complaint, without asking for a thing. She had done it with his own father's tools, tools he had neglected. When she came back out, her hands were empty. She stopped a few feet from him, not looking at him, instead looking out at the field where the plow sat abandoned. The sun was higher now, beating down on the land. Jack finally found his voice. It came out as a rough, quiet rasp, full of a confusion he could no longer hide. Where in God's name did you learn to do that? Ellie was silent for a long moment. She finally turned her head just enough to look at him, her gray eyes holding a depth of experience that he was only just beginning to glimpse. There was no pride in her expression, only a quiet, unbreachable wall of reserve. "You learn what you must," she replied. And with that, she turned away from him and walked back toward the quiet solitude of the farmhouse, leaving him standing alone in the yard, the world tilted on its axis. The words hung in the air between them for days. "You learn what you must." It was an answer that explained everything and nothing at all. Jack found himself replaying the moment in the barn over and over. The smell of hot metal and horse. The steady, confident tap of the hammer in her hands. The way she had met his gaze without flinching. Her gray eyes holding a universe of experiences he could not begin to guess at. He had expected a city girl, fragile and useless. He had received a puzzle, wrapped in quiet competence. They fell into a strange, silent rhythm. He would rise before the sun, the old habit of a lifetime. Yet he would find the lamp already lit in the kitchen, the scent of coffee, a dark, rich greeting. Ellie would be there, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of purpose. She never crowded him, never filled the silence with pointless chatter. She simply existed in his space, a quiet, observant presence that was beginning to feel less like an intrusion and more like a fixture. He would work the far fields, mending fences or checking on the herd, and catch a sight of her. Sometimes she was tending the small vegetable garden she had started near the house, a patch of earth he had let go to weed years ago. Other times she was scrubbing the porch boards or airing out the dusty linens in his mother's old trunk. She asked for nothing. She demanded nothing. And this, more than anything, unnerved him. Every morning he woke up braced for a complaint, for tears, for a demand to be sent back to wherever she came from. Instead, he got biscuits and bacon left on a warm plate. He got a patched tear in his work shirt, the stitches small and neat. He got the sense he was being watched, not with judgment, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity that mirrored his own. He was a man who understood leverage, threats, and brute force. He did not understand this quiet offering of capability. It felt like a language he had never learned, and he suspected she was fluent. One afternoon, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the dusty yard. The air was still, promising a storm that never seemed to arrive. Jack was coming back from the creek, the sweat sticking his shirt to his back, when he saw the plume of dust on the horizon. It was moving too fast for a farm wagon, too arrogant for a neighbor. He knew before he could even make out the rider. Only one person rode a horse that hard just to cross a few miles of open land. His hand instinctively went to his side, though he wore no gun. It was a phantom gesture, a memory of a time when a man could solve his problems more directly. Caleb Thorne reined his beautiful, lathered bay horse to a sharp halt, churning up the dry ground in front of the porch. He was dressed in a tailored black coat and polished boots that seemed to mock the grit and sweat of the ranch. He dismounted with a flourish, a smirk already plastered on his handsome face. He completely ignored Jack, his eyes scanning the property with an air of ownership, before they landed on Ellie, who had just stepped out of the farmhouse, wiping her hands on an apron. Caleb swept his hat from his head in a grand, mocking bow. "Well, well, Mrs. Callahan, I presume. Bartholomew sent me to extend his official welcome to Prosperity Gulch." His voice was slick with false charm. "Though it seems my timing is impeccable, I've arrived just in time to see the happy couple." Jack moved to stand between them, his body a solid wall of resentment. The air crackled. The smell of Caleb's expensive cologne was a foul intrusion on the honest sense of hay and earth. "You're not welcome here, Thorne. State your business and get off my land." Caleb's smirk widened. He loved this. He fed on this powerless rage. "My business, Callahan, is with the lady. Just ensuring the council's investment is being properly cared for." He let his gaze drift over Ellie, a slow, insolent appraisal that made Jack's hands curl into fists. The insult was clear. She was not a wife. She was property, a piece of the transaction. Ellie had not moved. Her posture was straight, her hands still. She watched Caleb with the same detached curiosity she might show a peculiar insect. "I must say," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, greasy tone, "I was surprised. I thought your pride would let the whole ranch turn to dust before you agreed to our terms. But I suppose every man has his needs." He took a step closer to Ellie. "And I'm sure you're proving to be quite dutiful, keeping the house warm for him at night." The words were a slap, lewd, condescending, and aimed to humiliate them both, to reduce their forced arrangement to the crudest possible terms. Jack felt a surge of hot, black fury rise in his throat. He took a step forward, the world narrowing to the smug satisfaction on Caleb's face. He was going to wipe that look off himself, no matter the consequences. He would break his hands on him. He would see him bleeding in the dust of the land his family had bled for. But before he could move, a calm, quiet voice cut through the tension. It was Ellie. She had not raised her voice. She had not gasped or flinched. She had simply spoken, her tone as level as the horizon. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Caleb, surprised, turned his full attention to her, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He thought he had her. He thought she was about to plead or cry by. Ellie took one small, deliberate step forward, out from behind Jack's protective shadow. She looked Caleb Thorne directly in the eye. Her own eyes were like chips of winter ice. "I have spent a great deal of time in stables, Mr. Thorne. I've been around some of the finest bloodlines in the country." She paused, letting the statement hang in the thick, hot air. Caleb's smile faltered slightly. He was confused. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. "One learns a great deal in a stable," Ellie continued, her voice still unnervingly calm. "One learns, for instance, the important difference between breeding and manners. Some of the most valuable stallions have the worst temperaments. They kick and bite and make a great deal of noise." She let her gaze drop for a fraction of a second to his polished, dusty boots, then brought it back to his face. "But no matter how fine their pedigree, you would never let them inside the house." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. The insult was so sharp, so precise, it took a moment for Caleb to even register the cut. She had not shouted. She had not sworn. She had simply taken his own sense of high-born superiority and turned it against him with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She had called him an ill-mannered animal. Caleb's face went from smug to confused to a deep, blotchy red. A vein pulsed in his temple. He was utterly speechless. He had come here expecting a timid, broken woman he could taunt and a furious, helpless man he could provoke. He had found something else entirely. He had been outmaneuvered, intellectually disarmed in front of his rival. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering like a landed fish. Jack stood frozen, the rage that had consumed him just a moment before draining away, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. He had been ready to fight a physical battle, a brawl in the dirt. He had been prepared for violence. He had not been prepared for this. He had just witnessed a kill, executed with nothing but a few quiet words. He had been so focused on protecting her, on seeing her as a vulnerability, a weakness Thorne had forced upon him. He never imagined she could be a weapon in her own right. Caleb finally found his voice, a strangled, furious rasp. You, you will regret that. He pointed a trembling finger at Ellie, then at Jack. Both of you. This is not over. The threat was empty, the words of a boy who had been bested and had no other recourse. He spun around, yanked his horse's reins viciously, and swung himself into the saddle with clumsy, angry haste. He kicked the horse into a gallop, not even looking back, fleeing the scene of his own humiliation. The cloud of dust he had arrived in was now the cloud of his retreat. It slowly settled back onto the parched ground, leaving a ringing silence behind. The afternoon heat returned, seeming even heavier than before. Jack could feel the sweat on his brow, the thunder of his own heart. He turned slowly, his boots crunching in the dirt. Ellie was still standing there, her hands now clasped loosely in front of her. The icy calm in her eyes had melted away, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She was looking at him, waiting for his reaction. He knew what she must be expecting. Anger, perhaps. Resentment that she had spoken for herself, that she had drawn more of the Thorns' fire down upon them. He should feel angry. He should feel that his authority had been challenged on his own land. He should feel 100 different things that the old Jack, the one from a week ago, would have felt. But he felt none of them. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the woman who had faced down Caleb Thorne without a tremor in her voice. The woman who could shoe a horse and mend a fence and start a garden from nothing. The woman who met his own stubborn silence with a resilience he was only just beginning to comprehend. The word dutiful echoed in his mind, Caleb's greasy insult. And Jack realized, with a jolt that went deeper than anger, that she was. She was dutiful. Not to him, not to the contract. She was dutiful to herself. She possessed a core of steel he hadn't known existed. His father's old pocket watch felt heavy in his pocket. It was a symbol of his legacy, of the burden he carried alone. For the first time standing there in the oppressive heat, looking at this stranger who was his wife, the burden felt fractionally lighter. He was still trapped. He was still bound to a deal he hated. But the nature of his prison had changed. He was no longer locked in a cage with a helpless bird. He was locked in with something far more dangerous and far more interesting. As Caleb's dust settled completely, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains, Jack looked at Ellie. He saw not the symbol of his defeat, not the price of his land, not the woman forced upon him by his enemy. He saw a person, fierce and intelligent and unbroken. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, he looked at her not with resentment, but with a startling and unfamiliar surge of respect. The sound of Caleb Thorne's retreating horse faded into the ceaseless whisper of the wind. Dust, kicked up in his angry departure, settled slowly back onto the hard-packed earth of the yard. Jack stood frozen, his hands still resting on the rough timber of the porch post. The wood felt solid, real beneath his palm. Inside his chest, something had shifted, a tectonic plate of certainty grinding against a new, unfamiliar continent. He had expected to feel a grim satisfaction at Caleb's humiliation. He had expected to see the smug city woman gloat. Instead, he felt a confusing jolt of protection. No, that was not the right word. It was a surge of shared defiance. When Caleb had directed his venom at Ellie, it was an attack on the ranch, on his home. And she had met it, not with hysterics or tears as he might have imagined, but with a quiet, lethal precision that had sliced right through Caleb's arrogance. Jack had spent his whole life fighting for this land with his fists and his sweat. He had never seen someone fight for it with words as sharp as honed steel. He slowly turned his head. Ellie was still standing where Caleb had left her, her posture ramrod straight. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon where the distant mountains drew a jagged purple line against the pale blue sky. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her. She did not seem shaken. She seemed composed, thoughtful, as if she had just concluded a particularly tedious business transaction. The sight was unnerving. This woman, this stranger, was a complete enigma. He had seen her as a cage, a punishment delivered by Bartholomew Thorne. But her quiet strength was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a fortress wall he hadn't known was being built. Jack cleared his throat. the sound rough and loud in the sudden quiet. "Are you all right?" The question felt clumsy, inadequate. He wasn't used to asking it. He wasn't used to caring about the answer. Ellie finally turned her head, her gray eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, only a faint, weary intelligence. "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Callahan." She used his formal name, and it put a careful distance back between them. Men like Caleb Thorne are predictable. Their cruelty is a substitute for character. She said it simply, as a statement of fact, then turned and walked back toward the house. Her steps were measured, unhurried. Jack watched her go, the back of her simple dress a stark figure against the weathered wood of the farmhouse. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of work. They were good for building fences, for breaking horses, for pulling a trigger if needed. But they had been useless against Caleb Thorne's particular brand of poison. Ellie's words, however, had been a perfect antidote. For the first time, he felt a startling and unfamiliar surge of respect. It was a disorienting feeling, and he did not like it one bit. The rest of the day passed in a strained, humming silence. They worked. Jack repaired the harness Caleb's horse had jostled, his movements methodical, his mind far away. He could feel Ellie's presence without seeing her. He heard the rhythmic thump of a rug being beaten clean against the side of the house. Later, he caught the scent of soap and lye and knew she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, a task he himself had neglected for weeks. She did not ask for his help. He did not offer it. They orbited each other like two planets held in a delicate, unspoken gravity, a new awareness crackling in the space between them. Every mundane sound, every normal chore, felt charged with new meaning. The familiar rhythms of the ranch were off kilter. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, Jack found himself hesitating at the door to the farmhouse. He normally ate his dinner standing over the sink or out on the porch, alone with his thoughts. But tonight that felt wrong. It felt like a retreat. Taking a deep breath that tasted of dust and cooling air, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was warm and smelled of roasted potatoes and something savory he couldn't name. A single lantern on the table cast a pool of soft, golden light, pushing the shadows into the corners of the room. The table, his father's table, was set for two. Two plates, two forks, two cups. It was the first time since his mother's passing that a meal had been laid out with such intention. It struck him with the force of a physical blow, a ghost of memory rising from the worn wood grain. Ellie was standing by the stove, her back to him. "Dinner is ready," she said without turning around. Her voice was quiet, neutral. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. He sat down, feeling large and awkward in the small circle of light. Ellie brought two plates to the table. They were piled with slices of roasted chicken and potatoes, things he had in the larder but rarely had the patience to prepare so carefully. She placed one in front of him and then took her own seat opposite. The silence that fell was different from the hostile quiet of the days before. This silence was heavy with unspoken questions. It was a waiting silence. They ate. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against porcelain and the sigh of the wind outside. Jack focused on his plate, chewing methodically. He could feel her eyes on him from time to time, but he refused to look up. He felt exposed, as if the simple act of sharing a meal at this table stripped away a layer of his armor. This was intimacy. This was domesticity. This was everything the marriage contract was supposed to represent and everything he had fought against. And yet, here he was. After what she had done, after the way she had stood her ground, running her out no longer seemed like an option. And that thought was more terrifying than any threat from Thorne. His gaze drifted past her to the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. On it sat a small, silver-framed photograph, tarnished with age. It was the only personal object he kept in the main room. A man and a woman, their faces weathered by the sun, were squinting happily into the camera. The woman had her head leaned against the man's shoulder. They stood in front of an unfinished version of this very house. "Your parents." Ellie's voice was soft, barely disturbing the quiet. Jack's head snapped up. He hadn't realized he was staring. He looked at her, then back at the photograph. He gave a single, curt nod. Words of dismissal formed on his tongue. "It's nothing." It's just an old picture. But they wouldn't come out. After the day's events, after her quiet display of courage, a simple dismissal felt like an insult. He swallowed. Yes, he said, his voice husky. That was taken the year they finished the main house, before I was born. Ellie's gaze softened as she looked at the picture. They look happy, she said. They seem like they belong right here. Something in her tone, a note of genuine, unforced observation, broke through his defenses. He looked at the photograph again, seeing it not just as a memory, but through her eyes. They did, he heard himself say. My father used to say this land wasn't just dirt and rock. He said it was a promise. He'd put his hand on my shoulder and point out at the creek and say, that water is the blood of this place, Jack, and the land is the bone. You take care of it, and it will always take care of you. The words came out before he could stop them. A torrent breaking through a dam he had spent years building. He could almost feel his father's heavy hand on his shoulder, smell the faint scent of tobacco and leather. He stopped abruptly, horrified at his own vulnerability. He had not spoken of his parents to anyone in years. He braced himself for a platitude, for some empty, polite phrase of sympathy. But Ellie just watched him, her expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. After a long moment she spoke. A promise, she repeated quietly, almost to herself. She looked down at her own hands, resting on the table. They were clean, but the first signs of hard work were beginning to show on them. I grew up in a place with many promises. They were all written on paper, signed and sealed. Promises of status, of advantageous matches, of a name that opened doors. She paused, a faint wry smile touching her lips. It did not reach her eyes. I learned early that those promises were not for me. They were for the family name. I was simply the one designated to carry it. Like a prize mare, valued for her bloodline, whose own thoughts and desires were irrelevant. She did not speak with self-pity. She spoke with the detached clarity of someone stating a long-accepted truth. The rooms were large, the dresses were beautiful, and the loneliness was absolute. You were always surrounded by people, but you were never ever seen. Jack stared at her. His world, a world of sun and dirt and the visceral struggle for survival, felt a million miles away from the life she described. And yet, the core of her words struck him with a shocking, painful familiarity. He was being valued for his land, not for himself. He was a piece in Thorne's game, an obstacle to be managed. She had been a piece in her family's game, an asset to be traded. The gilded cage she spoke of was different from his dusty prison, but they were both cages nonetheless. He thought of his solitary nights, the crushing weight of responsibility, the feeling that he was utterly alone in his fight. The loneliness was not absolute, but it was a close and constant companion. He looked from her face, so composed and yet so full of a deep, hidden sorrow, to the worn, empty chair beside him, the one his father used to sit in. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy or awkward. It was a shared space filled with the unspoken acknowledgments of their separate, yet similar, isolation. The anger and resentment he had held on to so tightly had begun to dissolve, replaced by something he couldn't name. It was not friendship, it was not trust, it was recognition. The lantern flame dipped and swayed, casting their shadows long and dancing on the wall behind them. The wind howled a low, mournful song around the corners of the house. Outside, the world was vast and empty and dark. But inside this small circle of light, the space between them had shrunk. Their eyes met across the worn wooden table, across the remains of their shared meal. And for the first time, they saw each other not as jailer and prisoner, not as rancher and unwanted bride, but as two profoundly lonely people, unexpectedly finding a reflection in a stranger's gaze. The quiet in the farmhouse was different now. It was no longer a heavy silence, but a space filled with unspoken thoughts. In the evenings, Jack would sit with a leather harness, listening to the soft turn of a page from Ellie's room. He was a man used to the solitude of the wind, and this quiet human sound was an unfamiliar comfort. He kept replaying their dinner conversation. Her words about being valued for a name echoed his own fear that the Callahan legacy would die with him. The change came on a morning so still you could hear a fly buzz from 100 feet away. Jack was walking the dewy northern pasture when he saw it. A young steer stood apart from the herd, its head low, its breath ragged. A thin line of foam crusted its mouth. A cold, sharp dread coiled in his gut. Farther on, two more heifers were down, their legs twitching. He had seen this sickness before, as a boy beside his father. It had moved through their herd like a ghost and almost broken them. Now it was back, and he was alone. Losing even a dozen cattle was a blow. Losing a quarter of the herd would be ruin. He turned back toward the farmhouse, his long strides eating up the ground. The world had narrowed to a single terrifying point. He was going to lose it all. He walked into the house, the scent of toffee barely registering. Ellie was at the stove, but she turned, a question in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Jack couldn't meet her gaze. "Sickness," he said, the word like a stone. "In the herd, it's moving fast." He finally looked at her, his eyes hard with despair. "There's nothing to be done. You cut your losses before it takes everything." He walked to the wooden rack by the door and took down his rifle. The cool metal was a grim comfort. He was preparing to execute his own future, one bullet at a time. Ellie watched him, her gray eyes taking in the rifle, the grim set of his jaw, the utter defeat in his posture. "Wait," she said. Her voice cut through the silence. Jack didn't look up. He pushed a cleaning patch through the barrel. "There's nothing to wait for. It's kinder this way, faster." "Let me see them," she insisted. It was not a request. Her tone held an authority that made him pause. He finally looked up, frustration crossing his face. "And what will you do? They're livestock, Eleanor. This is how it works." The use of her full name was a sharp, bitter edge. She did not flinch. "I am not going to weep. I want to see the animals, Jack." Something in her calm broke through his despair. With a sigh that felt ripped from his soul, he stood, leaving the rifle on the table. "Fine," he clipped it out. "Come on." He led her to the small pen where he'd isolated the sick animals. The air was thick with their pain breathing. Jack stood back, his arms crossed, a spectator at his own ruin. But Ellie unlatched the gate and walked right in. She knelt, her dress brushing the dirty ground. Her gaze was fixed on the earth, on the patches of grass. Her fingers sifted through the blades, searching. Jack watched, a foolish flicker of hope warring with his skepticism. Then she stopped. Her hand closed around a small, unassuming plant with fern-like leaves and tiny white flowers. She pulled it from the ground, root and all, and stood. "This," she said, her voice low and certain. "It's water hemlock. It thrives in wet soil. The creek must be pushing the seeds into the pasture." Jack stared at the plant. He had seen it 100 times but never made the connection. A bitter laugh escaped him. "Well, that's it then. There's no cure for that." "You're right," Ellie agreed, her eyes fixed on his. "There is no cure, but it's not a death sentence. You don't cure it, you fight it." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "My grandfather raised horses," she explained. "He taught me about remedies. We can make a drench, activated charcoal to absorb the toxin, a poultice of yarrow and plantain to soothe them. I've seen it work, but we have to move now." She laid out the plan with a staggering clarity, telling him what herbs she needed and where they would grow. He looked from the disassembled rifle on his kitchen table to the fierce determination in her face. He saw a choice. He could follow the path of surrender, or he could follow her. "All right," he said, "tell me what to do." The rest of the day was a blur of motion. They gathered herbs by the creek, Ellie pointing them out, Jack's large hands surprisingly gentle. As dusk settled, the barn became their battleground. Lantern light cast long shadows. The air grew thick with the smell of crushed herbs, smoke, and sickness. They worked in focused silence. Ellie crushed herbs with a stone. Jack ground cooled charcoal into a fine powder. Then came the hardest part. Jack cornered the first weak steer, wrestling its head into the crook of his arm. "Hold him steady," Ellie said, her voice even. She pried open its jaw and poured the drench down its throat. Their initial awkwardness melted into a fluid rhythm. "The bucket," he would grunt, and she was already there. "Wipe its mouth," she would say, and a cloth was already in his hand. They moved around each other, a partnership forged in sweat and fear. Through the long hours, Jack watched her. Her hair was loose, her face smudged with charcoal. There was nothing of the delicate city woman left. He saw a resilience that matched the unforgiving land. A thought struck him with physical force. She was not fighting to help him save his ranch. She was fighting to save their ranch. The word hung in his mind, foreign and yet perfectly right. In that moment, she was not his cage. She was the partner he never knew he needed. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, they treated the last animal. Exhaustion settled deep into their bones. Wordlessly, they walked out and leaned against the fence, overlooking the eastern plains. The sky was soft pink and orange. They were too tired for words. Jack rested his hand on the weathered wood. Ellie shifted beside him, and the back of her hand brushed against his. The touch was fleeting, accidental. But in the vast silence, it felt like a thunderclap. He didn't pull away. He held his breath, realizing she hadn't either. That light pressure was more real, more binding than the ink on their marriage contract. It was a silent promise, forged in their darkest hour. The sun rose on a world that felt different. The air was still thick with the scent of wood smoke and medicinal herbs, a lingering ghost of their long night's work. In the pale morning light, the cattle were standing, quiet but alive. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket over Jack, but it was woven with a strange new thread of relief. Leaning against the fence post where their hands had brushed, he could still feel the phantom warmth of her skin against his. It was a fleeting touch, an accident born of weariness, but it had left an imprint deeper than a brand. The silence that had once been a wall of resentment between them now felt like shared territory. It was a silence of tired bones and a job well done. In the days that followed, the very rhythm of Red Creek Ranch shifted. It was no longer the solitary drumbeat of one man's labor against an unforgiving land. It became a harmony, a quiet duet. The change wasn't spoken of, it was simply lived. Mornings began not with a grudging avoidance in the kitchen, but with a shared pot of coffee. Jack would rise from habit in the pre-dawn chill, only to find Ellie already moving in the dim lamplight, her silhouette soft against the rising sun. She would have the fire going, the scent of baking biscuits already filling the small house. She never said a word about his late starts. She simply handed him a mug, her fingers brushing his, and the warmth spread from his hands straight to his chest. He found himself anticipating her movements, and she, his. When they were repairing the section of the corral damaged by a spooked steer, he reached for the hammer without looking, and her hand was already there, placing it firmly in his. He'd turn to grab a length of rope, and she would have it uncoiled, ready. There was no need for orders, no need for requests. She saw what needed doing, sometimes even before he did. She saw the wobble in the wagon wheel, the fraying of the harness leather, the first signs of blight on the corn. She worked with a quiet competence that continued to unnerve and astonish him. This woman, who he had assumed would be a fragile burden, was becoming the bedrock of his daily existence. One sweltering afternoon, the pump for the main well gave out with a final grinding squeal. The sound was a death knell in the dry season. Jack felt a familiar cold dread wash over him. A broken pump meant hauling water by the bucket from Whispering Creek, a back-breaking task that would steal days of precious time. He stormed into the barn, his mind racing, his fists clenched with frustration. He was pulling out the heavy block and tackle when Ellie appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hands. It was his father's old engineering manual, a book he hadn't opened in 10 years. She had a smudge of grease on her cheek, and her gray eyes were clear and focused. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just said, "The main gasket has probably dried out and cracked. We'll need to hoist the pipe assembly, but if we can fashion a new seal from some old leather, we might not need to replace the whole mechanism." He just stared at her. He had been preparing for a week of brutal, mindless labor. She was preparing for a solution. He felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. "I'll get the heavy leather from the harness room," was all he could manage to say. They worked together under the punishing sun. The air was still and suffocating, shimmering with heat above the dusty ground. The only sounds were the creak of the rope, the clank of metal on metal, and their shared, steady breathing. She seemed immune to the heat, her movements precise and economical. She pointed out the corroded bolts he needed to loosen, her small hands surprisingly strong as she helped him guide the heavy iron pipe out of the well casing. He was acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of soap and sun on her skin. He felt the sweat trickle down his spine, and it had nothing to do with the heat. Hours later, after they had cut and soaked and fitted a new leather gasket, they lowered the assembly back into place. Jack primed the pump handle, pushing it up and down. At first, there was only a dry, sucking gasp. His heart sank, but then a gurgle rose from the depths, followed by a hesitant splash. A stream of cool, clear water poured from the spout, dark and beautiful against the parched earth. Ellie let out a small, quiet breath of relief beside him. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face was flushed from the effort. Strands of dark hair stuck to her damp forehead, and she was smiling. Not a polite, distant smile, but a genuine, brilliant smile of shared victory. In that moment, something inside Jack's chest cracked open. It was a painful, unfamiliar feeling, like a bone resetting itself. This wasn't just respect anymore. It wasn't just partnership. It was something deeper, something warmer and more terrifying. He had spent his entire life building walls around his heart to protect his father's legacy, to protect himself from the pain of loss. Now, this woman, this stranger forced upon him, was dismantling those walls brick by brick, without even seeming to try. He started watching her, not just as a partner in work, but as a man watches a woman. He watched her in the evening as she sat by the fire, mending one of his torn shirts. The needle moved with a swift, sure grace in her fingers. The firelight played on the planes of her face, turning her thoughtful expression into something mysterious and lovely. He noticed the way she would bite her lower lip when she was concentrating, a small, unconscious habit that made his own breath catch in his throat. He had lived in this house his whole life, but she was the one who was making it feel like a home. The rooms were cleaner, there were wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, and the silence was no longer empty. One day, he was out checking the far fences, a lonely task he usually cherished for its solitude. From a ridge, he could see the ranch house below. He saw Ellie in the small vegetable garden she had insisted on planting. She was on her knees in the dirt, tending to the rows of young plants. The sun was setting behind her, casting a halo of gold around her hair, which had come loose from its practical bun. She was talking, her voice too low to carry on the wind, but he could see her head inclined. He squinted and realized she was talking to one of the stray cats that lived in the barn. She reached out and stroked its back, her movements gentle and unhurried. A profound ache settled in his chest. It was an image of such simple, quiet peace that it felt like a punch to the gut. He, Jack Callahan, the man who prided himself on needing no one, was watching a woman talk to a cat and feeling an overwhelming urge to be down there with her, to be part of that circle of peace. The feeling was a constant, low-grade fever now. It ambushed him at unexpected moments. When she laughed at one of the horse's antics, a clear, musical sound that was so rare and precious. When he saw her standing on the porch, staring out at the vast, empty land with an expression he couldn't quite read, a mix of longing and resilience. His heart would give a painful lurch, a sudden violent thud against his ribs that left him breathless. He would have to turn away, gripping a fence rail or the handle of a tool, his knuckles white, until the feeling subsided. Love, he realized with a jolt of pure panic, felt a lot like being wounded. It was a vulnerability he didn't know how to defend against. The marriage contract, the hated document from Bartholomew Thorne, still sat in a drawer in his father's desk. He had thought of it as a leash, a symbol of his defeat. But now the thought of it being nullified, of her being free to leave, sent a spike of ice through his veins. The idea of this house falling silent again, of waking up to an empty kitchen, of facing the endless work alone once more, was unbearable. She had become as vital to this place as the water in Whispering Creek. No, he admitted to himself, in the dark of his own room one night, she was more vital. The ranch was just land and wood and livestock. Ellie was the life. A few evenings later, the air was cool and sweet with the smell of recent rain. The dust had settled and a million stars were blazing in the vast, dark sky. The work was done for the day. They sat on the front porch steps, the way they often did now, nursing cups of coffee that had long gone cold. The crickets sang their relentless chorus. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was a comfortable quiet, full of the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. Jack stared out at the silhouette of the distant hills, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing her face in his mind, lit by the sun in the garden. He was hearing her laugh. A war was raging inside him. The need to speak, to give voice to the storm of emotion she had unleashed in him, was a physical pressure in his throat. He wanted to tell her thank you, not just for the cattle or the well or the fence, but for all of it. For staying, for seeing the value in this place he fought so hard for making him feel something other than anger and grief for the first time in years. The words were there, right behind his teeth, simple and true. Ellie. He opened his mouth. A small, choked sound escaped, half word, half breath. The vastness of what he wanted to say, of what he felt, was too much. The words were a logjam in his throat. Fear seized him, fear of her reaction, fear of sounding like a fool, fear of what would happen after the words were spoken, changing everything forever. What if she didn't feel the same? What if she saw his confession as just another chain, another cage, the life she had been so desperate to escape? The ingrained habit of a lifetime of solitude slammed a door shut in his mind. He was Jack Callahan. He stood alone. It was safer that way. The moment stretched, fragile and taut. He snapped his mouth shut. The unspoken words tasted like ash. He could feel her shift beside him, could feel her gaze on the side of his face. He didn't dare to look. He knew what he would see. He knew her intelligent, perceptive eyes would be full of a question she was too kind to ask out loud. He could feel her waiting, giving him the space to find his courage. But it was gone, vanished into the dark corners of his own stubborn pride. Slowly she turned her head away. Jack risked a glance. Her profile was etched against the starlight, her expression unreadable now. She was looking out at the same dark hills, but he knew they were both seeing two very different landscapes. He had built a bridge and then, at the very last step, had refused to cross it. With a quiet, final movement, he shook his head just once, a tiny, dismissive gesture meant for himself more than for her. He looked away, focusing on the distant, unblinking stars, leaving the confession to hang in the cool night air. It was a ghost between them, a heavy, invisible thing that settled in the space where a truth should have been. The confession Jack had swallowed hung between them in the cold night air. Ellie felt its weight, saw the silent battle in his eyes. He was a man of fences, unable to find the gate to his own soul. With a stiff shake of his head, he looked away toward the dark horizon. The moment shattered, and her question died unanswered. Later, lying in the dark, Ellie listened to the house settle. She heard the floorboards creak from Jack's restless pacing, a sound that matched her own turmoil. For a single second, the walls around him had trembled. She was not angry they held firm, but astonished they had moved at all. In this quiet, dusty place, she was finally seen. The days that followed passed in a new rhythm. They worked with the same efficiency, but an awareness now existed between them. When their hands brushed reaching for a tool, a jolt passed through her. Their glances lingered just a moment too long, the air thick with possibility. But the shadow of Bartholomew Thorne still poisoned everything. The threat appeared again in Prosperity Gulch. Ellie saw Caleb Thorne holding court with his father's men, his voice loud with whiskey. "Bartholomew's got it all figured out," Caleb slurred. "Progress requires new lines to be drawn. Callahan won't even know what happened until he's packing his wagon." Ellie froze. New lines to be drawn. The phrase was strange, the language of surveyors and mapmakers. A cold dread washed over her. Thorne's plan was not simply about choking them out with the drought. The water was just a distraction, while the real theft happened somewhere else. The ride back to Red Creek Ranch was a blur. She saw the winding path of Whispering Creek not as a source of life, but as a border, a line. She found Jack in the barn, his shoulders tense as he repaired a harness. "Jack," she said, her voice steady, "were there ever any disputes about the property lines?" He looked up, surprised. "No, never," he said firmly. "My father was a careful man, He kept a copy of every deed, every survey, said he kept his own library. He gestured toward the house. It's all in the old office. Can I see them? She asked. He stared at her, seeing the sharp urgency in her eyes. To let her in there was to trust her with his family's very identity. He gave a single curt nod. The key is on a nail above the fireplace. The office smelled of decaying paper and time itself. A large roll-top desk dominated the room. Ellie found the iron key and unlocked a large metal box tucked beneath it. Inside was a lifetime of meticulous records, bundles of letters, and thick ledgers. At the bottom, she found several rolled-up canvases secured with faded ribbons. These were the maps. For 2 days, the office became her world. She worked by sunlight and then by oil lamp. Jack would appear silently in the doorway with a mug of coffee or a plate of food. He never asked what she was looking for. He simply watched her, then left her to her work. She unrolled the oldest map first, dated 1883. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. She traced the boundary, which clearly followed the meandering course of Whispering Creek. A later survey from 1902 showed the exact same lines. Then she pulled out the modern county map she had bought in town. She spread it out beside the older ones. At first, it looked the same, but her eyes caught the change, a subtle, devastating one. On the new map, the northern border was a straight, clean line. It sliced across a wide bend in the creek, annexing the most valuable section where water pooled deep. That section now sat on the adjacent property, land Bartholomew Thorne had acquired 10 years ago. Her breath caught. It was fraud, cold and calculated, hidden on an official document. He had redrawn the map and stolen the creek itself, but it still felt incomplete. She went back to the box, her hands searching frantically. Tucked into an old account book, she found a thin, folded sheaf of papers. It was a letter and a proposal from a railroad company, dated 45 years ago. It proposed a new line running straight through the ranch's northern pastures. Jack's grandfather had refused the offer, but Ellie saw it clearly. The proposed route ran directly along the fraudulent property line Thorne had created. Everything clicked into place. The water rights, the forced marriage, the drought. It was all a smokescreen, a cruel diversion. Thorne knew about the old railroad proposal. He had spent a decade redrawing the map to seize the exact land the railroad would need. He would make a fortune from the right-of-way deal, leaving Jack with a crippled ranch and a stolen legacy. Ellie stood, the old maps in her hand, a cold fury coursing through her. This was not business. It was an attempt to erase a family from the land. She walked into the kitchen. Jack sat at the table, pieces of his cleaned rifle laid out on an oilcloth. He looked up as she entered, his eyes questioning. Without a word, she swept a space clear on the table. She laid the old, yellowed survey map down first. Then beside it, she unrolled the new county map. The two truths lay side by side in the lamplight. She planted a trembling finger on the spot where the maps diverged, where the creek's curve became a thief's straight line. Jack leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion, then darkening as he understood. He saw the slice of his land, his water, that had been carved away on paper. Ellie finally spoke, her voice quiet but filling the entire house. He's not just stealing your water, Jack. He's trying to steal your entire history. The kerosene lamp cast a flickering light on the two maps spread across the kitchen table. One was old and creased, drawn by his father's steady hand. The other was new, crisp, and brutally efficient. Jack's finger traced the phantom boundary Thorne had created, a line on paper with the power to steal his history. A cold rage, deeper than any he had felt before, settled in his chest. He looked up from the maps, his eyes finding Ellie's. She was watching him, her gaze steady, waiting. She had not offered empty comfort. She had simply presented the unyielding truth. "How did you know to look for this?" he asked, his voice rough. It was more than a question about maps. "No one has questioned these county lines in 50 years. I trusted them." Ellie leaned forward. "Because I grew up in a world built on paper, Jack. A world where contracts and deeds are the real weapons, and men like Bartholomew Thorne are the generals." She paused, her gaze dropping to the fraudulent document. "My father is one of those men." Jack straightened, weariness forgotten. He had assumed her family was respectable, perhaps fallen on hard times. "Your father?" My father is Thomas Vance, she said. The name of the railroad magnate landed with an almost physical weight in the quiet room. Jack stared, trying to reconcile the woman who mended his fences with the daughter of such a monumental figure. You're Thomas Vance's daughter? Then what are you doing here, married to me, on a ranch at the edge of nowhere? A shadow passed over Ellie's face, a flicker of deep pain. I am here because of who my father is, she said softly. To him, a daughter was not a person. She was an asset, a piece to be played in a game. My value was in the advantageous match I could make. Her voice grew colder. I was kept in a beautiful house, wearing beautiful clothes. It was a cage, Jack, a very elegant cage. When he arranged my marriage to a man 3 times my age to merge 2 shipping lines, I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't become another signature on one of his contracts. Jack listened, his own resentments feeling small in comparison. He had been fighting for his land. She had been fighting for her soul. So I ran, she continued, her voice regaining its strength. I took a small inheritance my mother left me and I disappeared. I needed a place where the name Vance meant nothing. When I heard about the arrangement in Prosperity Gulch, it seemed perfect. A legal fiction. A man who needed a wife on paper and a woman who needed a husband on paper to disappear. She trailed off, glancing around the rustic kitchen. She never expected to find a home. The pieces began to click into place for Jack. Her knowledge, her resourcefulness. She was a survivor of a different kind of wilderness. Thorne, he said, his focus snapping back to the immediate threat. What does he have to do with your father? Nothing directly, Ellie replied, her tone sharp and analytical. That's the key. Thorne is making a move for my father's most bitter rival, a man named Marcus Blackwood. Her finger tapped the map near Whispering Creek. Blackwood has been trying to secure a southern railroad route for years. A right-of-way through Red Creek Ranch would give him a shortcut. It would allow him to undercut my father's shipping rates. Thorne isn't just stealing your water, Jack. He's brokering a secret deal with Marcus Blackwood. The audacity of it was stunning. Thorne was using his ranch as a pawn in a war between giants. We go to the council, Jack said, his first instinct to expose the fraud. Ellie shook her head slowly. And who do you think is on the council, Jack? Men who owe Thorne money. Men who are afraid of him. They will vote to protect him, not you. They will declare your father's map a forgery. Despair, cold and familiar, tried to creep back in. Then what do we do, he asked, the question heavy with exhaustion. This was the moment. Ellie's eyes held a glint of something Jack had never seen before, a predatory cunning. We don't attack Thorne, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We attack his partner. We attack Marcus Blackwood. Jack was lost. How? The man is 1,000 miles away. No one is untouchable, Ellie countered, especially not men who build empires on risk. Before I left, I was my father's private secretary. He saw a hostess, but I was in the room. I read the letters he thought were over my head. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. He never realized I was paying attention. Marcus Blackwood is currently seeking a massive line of credit from Eastern banks to fund this new route. She leaned in closer, the lamplight catching the fire in her eyes. But I know something his investors don't. A year ago, one of his key bridges in the Sierras was found to have a critical structural flaw. His company used substandard steel to cut costs. My father discovered it through an informant. The report is buried in his private files, but I know exactly what it says. I typed it myself. Jack's heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. A single anonymous letter to the head of that banking consortium, Ellie continued with chilling precision, detailing the flaw, the bridge's location, and the firm that falsified the inspection. They would launch their own investigation. Blackwood's credit would be frozen. His deal with Thorne would become worthless overnight. The plan was brilliant. It was devastating, and it bypassed the corrupt council and went straight for the heart of the conspiracy. Jack looked at Ellie, truly seeing her. The woman who had come as a pawn was now the one who could destroy the entire game. All his grudging admiration coalesced into a single wave of awe. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile in months. The weight that had been crushing him began to lift. We can beat him, Jack said, the words full of a conviction that felt foreign and exhilarating. Ellie met his smile with one of her own, determination replacing the weariness in her eyes. Yes, she said, we can. He extended his hand across the table, across the maps that had once represented defeat. A pact, then, he said. Partners. Ellie placed her hand in his. Her grip was firm, her skin warm against his calloused palm. It was meant to be a handshake, a seal on their new alliance. But as their hands met, a current passed between them, silent and powerful. He didn't let go. His thumb moved almost unconsciously, brushing against the back of her hand. Her fingers tightened around his, a silent acknowledgement. This was more than a pact to save a ranch. It was a promise, and the moment their forced marriage became a true union, their handshake was held a moment too long, a silent pact sealed in the kitchen. The table became their war room, old maps spread across the wood. With a calloused finger, Jack traced his father's original property line along Whispering Creek. It was a clear, natural curve. Beside it, the new county map showed a stark, unnatural angle, the lie that Thorne had used to steal his water. Ellie's voice was steady, a contrast to the frantic beat of Jack's heart. They would not go to the council, Thorne's personal arena. Their plan was simpler and far more dangerous. They would go to the people. Jack spent the morning on horseback, carrying handwritten notes from Ellie. He rode to the small ranchers and homesteaders, people like Thomas Miller and the widow Sarah Gable. He found them mending fences, their faces etched with the same exhaustion he felt. Jack had always kept to himself, a solitary figure, so his arrival stirred suspicion. He offered no arguments, only the note and a quiet warning. Bartholomew Thorne is not the man you think he is. Come tonight, hear the truth. In their tired eyes, he saw a flicker of curiosity warring with a lifetime of keeping their heads down. By dusk, the general store was filled with the low murmur of anxious voices. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and coffee beans. Lantern light fell on the faces of ranchers and farmers, the very backbone of the valley. Jack stood near the front, his hands shoved in his pockets, feeling the weight of 100 gazes. Ellie was a figure of calm beside him. She had pinned the maps to a shipping crate, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. She pointed to the old survey map. This is the Red Creek Ranch as it was founded, she said, her finger tracing the true path of the creek. For 2 generations, this was law. The crowd leaned in, their doubts shifting to focus. Then Ellie laid the new map beside it. The difference was jarring. This is the map Bartholomew Thorne used to justify taking Mr. Callahan's water. Her finger tapped the fraudulent line. This line does not exist in reality. It was drawn for one purpose. It is a lie. A gasp went through the crowd. Thomas Miller stepped forward, squinting. I remember that old survey, he rasped. The line always followed the cottonwoods. Murmurs of agreement spread as people saw the physical theft for what it was. Jack stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors. Ellie has shown you what Thorne did to me, he began, his voice raw with an emotion he no longer hid. Now I will tell you what he plans for all of us. He explained the railroad, how Thorne was secretly consolidating a quarter to sell. He is not just stealing my water, Jack urged, his voice rising. He will control all shipping. He will set rates so high that none of us can afford them. He plans to make this entire valley worthless unless you work for him. The fear in the room became personal, suffocating. Every person could see their own future turning to dust. Sarah Gable's voice cut through the tension. He forced my husband to sell our north pasture last year. Said the bank needed to call in the loan. Another man shouted, he did the same to me. The room erupted. Decades of simmering resentment boiled over into open anger. At that exact moment, the door banged open. Bartholomew Thorne stood in the doorway, his brother Caleb smirking beside him. They had come to crush a small protest. They did not expect to see the entire town. They did not expect the wall of hostile faces that stared back at them. Caleb's smirk faltered. Bartholomew's mask of civility remained, but Jack saw the flicker of shock in his eyes. Well, well, Bartholomew said, his voice smooth as oil. Quite the gathering. I hope you are not letting Mr. Callahan fill your heads with his grievances. No one laughed. Thomas Miller, a man who usually flinched from Thorne's shadow, stepped forward. It is not just his grievance anymore, Thorne. It is all of ours. Bartholomew's gaze shifted to Ellie, his eyes filled with venom. And you, he sneered, stirring up trouble to protect your new investment. Ellie met his gaze without flinching. I am presenting the truth, something you seem to have misplaced. Caleb pushed past his brother, his face red with fury. My brother owns this town. He owns all of you. Jack moved between Caleb and Ellie. Not anymore. Just then, Sheriff Peters pushed through the crowd. He looked pale, his eyes darting between Thorne and the angry faces. Sheriff, Thorne commanded, disperse this illegal assembly and arrest this man, he pointed at Jack. The sheriff hesitated. He looked at Thorne, his patron. Then he looked at the faces of his neighbors. He saw Sarah Gable, whose children played with his own. He saw Thomas Miller, a man he had known his whole life. He saw people who were no longer afraid. I can't do that, Mr. Thorne, Peter stammered. What did you say? Thorne hissed. The sheriff swallowed, but he found his voice, drawing strength from the crowd. I said I can't. There are serious allegations here. There is evidence. He gestured toward the maps. He is a fraud, Sheriff, Sarah Gable cried out. His bank holds fraudulent deeds. The call was picked up by others. Check the records. It is all in the bank. The pressure was immense. The sheriff straightened his shoulders and faced Thorne fully. Mr. Thorne, he announced, his voice now loud and clear. I am placing the Prosperity Gulch Bank under official investigation. I will be impounding all your ledgers, pending a review by a federal marshal. A collective gasp was followed by a roar of approval. The color drained from Bartholomew's face. For the first time, Jack saw the man not as a titan, but as a gambler who had just lost everything on a single bet. His power was not in his fists, but in secrets, in hidden ledgers and fraudulent papers. The sheriff had just threatened to drag it all into the light. Bartholomew Thorne stood frozen, his empire of paper and fear crumbling around him. He and his brother were utterly alone in a sea of faces that now only showed contempt. The dust settled slowly in the street outside the general store. It coated everything in a fine reddish film, as if the land itself were reclaiming the town. Bartholomew and Caleb Thorne were gone, escorted by the sheriff, toward the brick building that had once been the seat of their power. They were not in chains, but the slump in Bartholomew's shoulders and the stunned, vacant look on Caleb's face were more damning than any iron shackles. The crowd began to dissolve, the other ranchers melting back toward their wagons, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. They spoke in low, buzzing tones, the story already beginning to shape itself into a local legend. A few of them approached Jack first. Old Man Hemlock, who had lost a parcel of land to Thorne 5 years prior, clapped a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. He said nothing, but his eyes, watery and tired, held a gratitude that was louder than words. Another rancher, a young man named Thomas, shook Jack's hand firmly. You did right by us, Callahan, he said, before nodding respectfully toward Ellie. Ma'am, he added, tipping his hat. It was a simple gesture, but in it was the entire town's reversal. She was no longer the outsider bride, the tool of their enemy. She was the architect of their liberation. Jack and Ellie stood together as the street emptied. The air, which had been thick with shouts and accusations, was now quiet, filled only with the gentle evening breeze. Jack looked at Ellie. Her hair had a few stray strands loose from her bun, and there was a smudge of dust on her cheek. He had the sudden, absurd urge to wipe it away. He had seen her handle horses, mend fences, and save his herd. He had watched her dismantle a tyrant with nothing more than a map and a sharp mind. Yet in this quiet moment, all he could see was the woman who had brought light back into his dark, lonely house. He felt a wave of something so potent, so overwhelming, it almost buckled his knees. It was more than respect, more than partnership. It was a terrifying, brilliant hope. The town council meeting, held 3 days later, was a formality. The same men who had sat in judgment of Jack now sat with nervous, placating smiles. They spoke of misunderstandings and unfortunate circumstances. They praised Jack's fortitude and commitment to the community. They were rats deserting a sinking ship, and Jack watched them with a cold, detached sense of victory. Bartholomew Thorne's name was spoken like a curse, a history they were all desperate to rewrite themselves out of. The council unanimously voted to nullify Thorne's claim on the water rights to Whispering Creek. The words were read into the record, and a gavel fell with a soft, final thud. The creek was his again. The lifeblood of Red Creek Ranch was secure. Then the council president, a portly man named Mayor Thompson, cleared his throat. He held up a single sheet of cream-colored paper, the marriage contract. Given the coercive nature of the agreement, he began, stumbling over the words, and in light of the fraudulent pretenses under which it was arranged, the council also declares this document null and void. He looked at Jack, then at Ellie, his expression pleading for forgiveness. You are, of course, free from any and all obligations. The contract is broken. He walked over and held the paper out to Jack. For a long moment, Jack just stared at it. This document had been his shame, the symbol of his defeat. He had signed it with a hand shaking from rage, surrendering his name and his future to save his land. He had looked at the woman who arrived because of it with resentment and suspicion. Now, that same piece of paper felt heavier than a gravestone. He finally took it. The paper was crisp, the ink black and severe. His own signature was a jagged scar at the bottom. He folded it once and then twice and slid it into his coat pocket without a word. The council members exhaled in a collective sigh of relief. For them, the matter was closed. But for Jack, the real reckoning had just begun. The wagon ride home was a mirror of their first journey together. The same sun beat down, the same wheels creaked over the same dusty road. The vast, empty landscape stretched out around them, but the silence was entirely different. Before, it had been a chasm of hostility and mistrust. Now it was a space filled with unspoken words, with the weight of a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly unwritten. Jack held the reins, his knuckles white. He could feel Ellie's presence beside him, a quiet warmth that had become as essential as the air he breathed. He had won. He had his land, his water, his independence. But the victory felt hollow, a new kind of loss threatening to take its place. The contract in his pocket was void. She was free. The thought repeated in his mind like a funeral drum. She was an educated woman, the daughter of a magnate. She didn't belong here in this dusty, hardscrabble life. She had come here as an escape, a temporary refuge. Now that the danger was past, what reason did she have to stay? He could picture it all too clearly. A polite farewell, a train ride back to her own world, and this ranch, his ranch, becoming silent and empty once more. The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any wound he had ever suffered. He risked a sideways glance. She was looking out at the horizon, her profile calm and composed. He couldn't read her thoughts. He had never been able to. Not really. It was one of the things that had first infuriated him, and now it was one of the things that captivated him completely. They arrived at the ranch as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning the familiar scene into something magical. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn and climbed down, his movements stiff. He came around to her side and held up a hand to help her down. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, a familiar contact that now felt charged with a new uncertainty. Her hand was steady in his, but her eyes held a question. It was the same question he had seen in her eyes on the porch that night, the one he had been too afraid to answer. He still felt that fear, but now it was dwarfed by a greater one, the fear of her silence, of her departure. They walked toward the house. The windows glowed with the last light of the day. A few months ago, this house was just a shelter, a place he existed in. It wasn't a home. A home was something his parents had made, full of warmth and laughter. After they were gone, it had just been walls and a roof. But Ellie had changed that. She had filled its silence not with noise, but with purpose, the smell of coffee in the morning, the scent of herbs drying by the stove, the quiet rustle of her turning the pages of a book by the firelight. She hadn't just saved his ranch. She had brought his home back to life. Inside, the main room was filled with warm evening shadows. The air was still and expectant. Ellie lit a lamp on the table, and the small flame pushed back the darkness, casting a soft golden light on their faces. She didn't move away. She just stood there, watching him, waiting. Jack's heart was hammering against his ribs. He felt like the boy he had been when he'd first tried to break a wild stallion, facing something powerful and untamable that could either throw him or carry him forward. He pulled the folded contract from his pocket. His fingers fumbled with the worn paper. He opened it and smoothed it out on the table. The signatures, the seals, the legalistic words all seemed like a joke now, a relic from another lifetime. He looked from the paper to her face. Her gray eyes were wide and luminous in the lamplight. "The council said it's void," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "They said you're free." The words hung in the air between them, stark and final. Free. It was what she had wanted, wasn't it? Freedom from her family, freedom from a forced marriage. He had been her jailer, and now he was setting her free. He watched her for any sign of relief, any hint of a smile that she was finally unbound. But her expression didn't change. She just held his gaze, her own heart a frantic bird in her chest. She had won her own battle, but the war for her heart was still being waged in the silence of this room. Jack's throat was dry. He could feel the legacy of his father, the stubborn, silent pride that had been both his strength and his curse. It told him to let her go, to not beg, to stand alone as he always had. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the railroad magnate's daughter or the strategic genius, but Ellie, the woman who had soot on her cheek from cleaning the stove, whose hands knew the feel of horsehide and soil, whose quiet presence beside him on the porch swing had become the anchor of his world. The pride shattered. All that was left was a raw, desperate need. He let the contract slip from his fingers. It fluttered to the wooden floor, a forgotten ghost. "I don't care what that paper says," he began, the words coming out in a rush, clumsy and honest. "I don't care what the council says. It was never about the contract, not for a long time." He took a hesitant step closer to her, closing the small distance between them. "This ranch, before you came, it was just a piece of land I was fighting for. It was my father's legacy, a duty. It was dust and work and loneliness." His voice cracked on the last word. He looked around the room at the worn furniture, the clean hearth, the life she had breathed into it. "You made it a home again, Ellie. I don't know how to run this place without you anymore. I don't want to." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, blurring the image of his face. This was it. This was the confession she had been waiting for, more powerful than any declaration of love. It was an admission of need, a statement of partnership that went far beyond deeds and contracts. It was the truth, spoken from the heart of a man who rarely spoke at all. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "You're free to go," Jack continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, full of a vulnerability he had never shown another soul. "You can go back to your world, and no one would blame you, but I'm asking you to stay. Not for the ranch, not because of any deal. I'm asking you to stay because this is your home, if you'll have it, because I can't imagine it without you in it." Ellie let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. A slow, brilliant smile broke through her tears. "Jack," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm already home." He searched her face, his blue eyes wide with a dawning, incredible joy. And then he closed the final inches between them. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb gently stroking her cheek, finally wiping away that smudge of dust. It was the most tender gesture she had ever known. He lowered his head, and their lips met for the first time. It wasn't a kiss of polite affection or tentative exploration. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was the release of months of unspoken tension, of shared hardship and silent understanding. It tasted of dust and relief, and the faint, sweet promise of rain on a dry land. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close against him, and she melted into his embrace, her hands coming up to tangle in his unruly dark hair. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken vow, every shared glance, every accidental touch. It was the end of a bargain and the beginning of a promise, freely given and fiercely held. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, resting their foreheads against each other. The little lamp on the table flickered, casting their joined shadow on the wall, a single unified shape. Later they stood on the porch, hand in hand. The night was cool and the sky was a blanket of stars, more brilliant and vast than any city sky. The familiar sounds of the ranch settled around them, the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance, the chirp of crickets in the tall grass. For years, Jack had stood on this porch alone, watching the sun set over his land, feeling the weight of his legacy like a yoke on his shoulders. The view was the same rolling hills and the dark ribbon of trees that marked Whispering Creek. But tonight, everything was different. The land no longer felt like a burden to defend, but a future to build. He squeezed her hand and she squeezed back. He looked from the sprawling dark land to her face, illuminated by the faint starlight. She was his partner, his ally, his home, and their future was as wide and as promising as the land that stretched out before them. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.